In the 1980s, G.I. Joe, a real American hero, wasn't just a cartoon, it was a full-on recruitment drive for every kid's imagination. Elite soldiers, outrageous villains, insane vehicles, and that unforgettable theme song turned this show into one of the most iconic action cartoons of all time. Today, we're diving into 10 wild facts about the classic G.I. Joe cartoon that most fans never knew. Before we deploy, subscribe to Pure Nostalgia and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next mission into the 80s and 90s pop culture that shaped our childhoods. Fact 1. It started as toys and comics, then became a cartoon. When people think of G.I. Joe, they often remember the cartoon first. But the 80s Real American Hero relaunch actually started with the toy line and a Marvel comic series that debuted in 1982. The comic was written by Larry Hama, who created detailed backstories, personalities, and code names for each character. The toys and comics were successful enough that Hasbro greenlit a 5-episode animated miniseries in 1983. When that miniseries became a ratings hit, it expanded into a full syndicated series that ran for years. So the cartoon wasn't the beginning, it was the marketing machine that turned G.I. Joe into a cultural phenomenon. The comics actually outlasted the original cartoon, running continuously through the early 90s and building even deeper lore that many fans consider essential to the G.I. Joe mythology. Fact 2. Yes, it was a giant toy commercial. And it worked. Like Transformers and He-Man, G.I. Joe was carefully engineered to sell action figures and vehicles. The show was essentially a 22-minute commercial, and new characters appeared on screen right when their toys hit store shelves. Each Joe had a unique codename, specialty, and visual design meant to stand out. The helmet, the uniform colors, the signature weapon. Duke was the all-American leader. Snake Eyes was the mysterious silent ninja. Scarlet was the skilled counterintelligence expert. Roadblock was the heavy machine gunner who spoke in rhymes. By the late 80s, G.I. Joe was generating over $1 billion annually in toy sales, making it one of the most successful toy lines in history. The cartoon didn't just support the toys, it was the reason kids wanted every single figure and vehicle. Fact 3. Knowing is half the battle was damage control. Those famous public service announcements at the end of episodes, teaching kids not to play with matches, not to talk to strangers, to wear bike helmets, weren't just for fun. They were added to balance out concerns about violence and militarism in children's programming. Critics and parent groups worried that a show about soldiers and war was too intense for kids. The PSAs were Hasbro and Sunbow's way of adding educational value to justify the action and explosions. Each PSA followed a simple formula. A kid gets into a dangerous situation, a G.I. Joe character shows up to teach a lesson, and the episode ends with, "Now you know, and knowing is half the battle." Those PSAs became so iconic that they're probably the most quoted part of the entire series today. What started as moral padding ended up being the show's most memorable cultural contribution. Fact 4. Cobra was invented specifically for the toy line. The original 1960s G.I. Joe toys didn't have a unified enemy. They fought generic soldiers or vague threats. For the 80s relaunch, Hasbro needed a clear, recognizable villain faction, so they invented Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world. Cobra had everything a great villain organization needs: a terrifying leader in Cobra Commander, a brilliant weapons dealer in Destro, a seductive intelligence officer in the Baroness, and a rogue ninja in Storm Shadow. They even had their own army of faceless blue-suited Cobra troopers and crimson-clad Crimson Guards. This clear hero versus villain structure made G.I. Joe more than just a military toy line. It became a mythology. Kids didn't just collect soldiers. They collected two opposing armies and created their own battles at home. Fact 5. Different animation studios created wildly different quality. G.I. Joe was animated by multiple overseas studios throughout its run, including Toei Animation in Japan and ACOM in South Korea. Because of this, the quality of animation varied wildly from episode to episode. Some episodes featured smooth, dynamic action sequences with detailed character movements and dramatic camera angles. Others looked choppy, with stiff character models and recycled animation loops. Hardcore fans can often identify which studio animated which episode just by looking at the visual style. This inconsistency was a side effect of the brutal production schedule required for syndicated cartoons in the 80s. Studios had to pump out episodes quickly and cheaply, and quality control wasn't always perfect. But for fans, those visual differences became part of the show's charm.
Fact 6. Characters were designed as toys first, personalities second. The creative process for new G.I. Joe characters often started in the toy design department. Artists would sketch concepts for new figures with unique looks and gimmicks. Those sketches would be sent to Larry Hama and the animation writers, who would then create personalities, backstories, and roles for each character. That's why G.I. Joe has such an incredibly diverse roster. Ninjas, Arctic specialists, sailors, jungle fighters, space troopers, communications experts, pilots, and even a guy whose specialty was literally entertainment. The toy designs drove the diversity, and the writers gave them life. Some characters became iconic despite having almost no screen time, simply because their toy design was so memorable. Others became fan favorites because the writers gave them standout personalities that elevated them beyond their plastic origins. Fact 7. It walked a careful line with violence and war themes. G.I. Joe was a show about soldiers fighting terrorists, but it had to be acceptable for Saturday morning TV. That meant carefully managing how violence was portrayed. Lasers flew everywhere, vehicles exploded constantly, and bases were destroyed, but you rarely saw anyone actually get hurt. Pilots always ejected safely from crashing jets. Soldiers dove out of exploding tanks at the last second. Even when buildings collapsed, characters would emerge unharmed, dusting themselves off with a joke. This became such a running joke among fans that it inspired parodies and memes decades later. The show also avoided directly referencing real-world conflicts or specific countries. Cobra was a ruthless terrorist organization not tied to any nation or political ideology. This kept the show in the realm of fantasy action rather than actual military propaganda.
Fact 8. The show went full sci-fi and fantasy when it wanted. While the premise was grounded in military action, G.I. Joe regularly veered into pure science fiction and even fantasy. Episodes featured weather-controlling devices, mind control technology, alternate dimensions, ancient mystical artifacts, cloning machines, and doomsday weapons that could reshape continents. These wild storylines gave the writers creative freedom and made the toy line even more ambitious. If the show introduced a flying fortress or an underwater assault vehicle, Hasbro could turn it into a massive playset. The crazier the concept, the more toys it could generate. This willingness to embrace the absurd kept the show unpredictable. One week, the Joes might be fighting Cobra in a jungle. The next, they could be battling a giant robot or stopping a mad scientist from opening a portal to another dimension. Fact 9. The voice cast brought serious talent and personality. The voices behind G.I. Joe weren't random picks. The show featured veteran voice actors who brought distinct personalities to every character. Chris Latta voiced both Cobra Commander and Starscream from Transformers, giving Cobra Commander that shrill, cowardly yet menacing tone that made him unforgettable. Arthur Burghardt gave Destro a deep, dignified voice that made him feel like a ruthless businessman rather than a typical cartoon villain. Michael Bell voiced Duke with heroic authority, and B.J. Ward made Scarlet smart and capable without being a damsel in distress. These performances gave the characters depth and made them memorable even decades later. Fans can still hear those voices in their heads when they see the characters, and that vocal identity is a huge part of why G.I. Joe still feels alive today.
Fact 10. The brand never really went away. Even after the original cartoon ended in the late 80s, G.I. Joe kept returning in new forms. The comic continued through the early 90s, direct-to-video movies extended the story, a new cartoon series launched in the 2000s with G.I. Joe Sigless 6, and later G.I. Joe Renegades. Live-action movies starring Channing Tatum and Dwayne Johnson brought the Joes to the big screen. Toy companies kept reissuing classic figures and creating new versions for each generation. The names, logos, and core conflict of G.I. Joe versus Cobra continued to evolve, proving that the brand had staying power beyond just 80s nostalgia. For many fans, though, the original A Real American Hero cartoon remains the definitive version, the one that defined the characters, introduced the vehicles, created the slogans, and made Yo Joe a battle cry that still echoes today. G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero was more than a toy commercial. It was a wild mix of military action, sci-fi adventure, and Saturday morning heroism that shaped 80s childhoods around the world. From the iconic theme song to unforgettable PSAs, from Cobra Commander's schemes to Snake Eye's silent badassery, G.I. Joe left a mark that still resonates. Now it's your turn. Which G.I. Joe or Cobra character was your favorite? Duke, Snake Eyes, Scarlet, Storm Shadow, Cobra Commander, Destro, the Baroness? Tell us your best G.I. Joe memory in the comments below. And if this mission down memory lane brought back great memories, subscribe to Pure Nostalgia, smash that like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into the cartoons and toys that made the 80s and 90s legendary.